The town of Ashford sat low in a valley where the wind carried dust and secrets in equal measure. It was 1883, and the railroad had not yet reached this corner of Montana territory. The land was hard, the winters were harder, and the people who lived there had learned long ago that survival meant keeping your head down and your business to yourself. Judge Harlan Cobb arrived in Ashford 6 years before the devil showed his hand. He came from back east, they said, with law books and a black robe and a manner that suggested refinement. He was a tall man, thin in the way that made him look taller still, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that never quite met yours straight on. He spoke in measured tones, quoted scripture on Sundays, and within a year had married the schoolteacher's daughter, a quiet woman named Mary who wore simple dresses and kept a vegetable garden behind their modest house on Elm Street. The courthouse was a 2-story building of weathered pine with a bell tower that rang each morning at 8. Cobb held court 3 days a week, settling disputes over water rights and cattle brands, hearing cases of theft and assault, and occasionally presiding over trials that carried the weight of life and death. In those early years, people said he was fair. They said he listened. They said Ashford was lucky to have a man of learning and principle to interpret the law in a place where the law was often the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. No one could say exactly when it started. Perhaps it was always there, coiled like a snake in the shadows of his chambers. Perhaps it grew slowly, fed by small compromises that seemed harmless at first. Or perhaps it began on a specific night, in a specific conversation, when a specific amount of money changed hands, and Judge Harlan Cobb discovered that his principles had a price after all. The first man to walk free was a drifter named Clay Bellows. He had shot a prospector outside the Silver Dollar Saloon in what witnesses called cold blood, though Bellows claimed self-defense. The prospector's name was Thomas Riddle, a family man with a wife and 3 daughters who lived in a cabin 2 miles north of town. The trial lasted one afternoon. Witnesses testified. The widow sat in the front row, her face pale and still as marble. Bellows took the stand and spun a story about being threatened, about fearing for his life, about having no choice. Judge Cobb listened with his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When the time came for his ruling, he spoke about reasonable doubt, about the sacred presumption of innocence, about how the law must err on the side of caution. He acquitted Clay Bellows of all charges. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Thomas Riddle's widow did not cry. She simply stood, gathered her shawl around her shoulders, and walked out into the afternoon sun with her daughters, trailing behind like lost birds. Bellows left town the next morning. No one saw Judge Cobb hand him the $50 in traveling money. No one saw the leather pouch that had been left in the judge's desk drawer 2 nights before the trial, containing $200 in gold coins and a note that said only for your fair consideration. The widow Riddle sold her claim 3 months later for a fraction of its worth. She and her daughters disappeared into the anonymous sprawl of San Francisco. The cabin stood empty for a year before someone else moved in. By then, most people had stopped talking about the trial. Life moved forward. Memories faded. Only the stain remained, invisible but spreading, like blood soaking into hard ground. The second case came 8 months later. A ranch hand named Victor Slade was accused of murdering his employer, a cattle baron named Dutch Harmon, during a dispute over wages. The evidence was substantial. Slade had been seen arguing with Harmon the day of the killing. Harmon's body had been found in the barn with a bullet through the heart. Slade's revolver was missing 1 round, and powder residue stained his right hand. 3 ranch hands were prepared to testify that Slade had made threats. But Slade had connections. His cousin ran a freight company that moved goods through 3 territories. His cousin had money, and more importantly, his cousin understood that in certain jurisdictions, the machinery of justice could be lubricated with the right incentives. The night before the trial, Judge Cobb received a visitor. The man wore a long coat despite the warm evening and kept his hat pulled low. They spoke in the judge's study while Mary slept upstairs. No voices were raised. No threats were made. The conversation was businesslike, almost cordial. An envelope was left on the desk. The visitor departed. When Victor Slade stood trial, Judge Cobb permitted testimony that should have been excluded. He questioned the credibility of witnesses in ways that suggested doubt, without stating it outright. He instructed the jury with language so carefully calibrated that acquittal became not just possible, but probable. Slade walked free on a humid afternoon in July, while Dutch Harmon's son sat in the gallery with his fists clenched and his face rigid with the kind of anger that never entirely goes away. Slade left Montana Territory within the week. Dutch Harmon's son sold the ranch 2 years later and moved to Denver, where he drank himself into an early grave. The ranch was subdivided and sold to speculators who let the land go fallow. The barn where Dutch Harmon died was torn down for lumber. Judge Cobb bought a new buggy that fall. Mary Cobb got a piano, though she rarely played it. They donated generously to the church building fund. The judge's reputation, if anything, seemed to grow. He was appointed to oversee a regional circuit, expanding his jurisdiction to 3 surrounding counties. He delivered a speech at the territorial courthouse in Helena about the sanctity of the law and the burden of impartial judgment. People who heard it said it was the finest oration they had ever witnessed. But in Ashford, something had shifted. It was nothing you could name precisely, nothing you could point to as evidence. It was more like a change in the air before a storm, a pressure that built behind the eyes. People began to notice patterns. Cases that should have ended in convictions instead ended in acquittals. Dangerous men walked free, while lesser crimes drew harsh sentences. A horse thief was sentenced to 5 years for stealing a mare worth $40. A claim jumper who had beaten a prospector nearly to death received 3 months and a fine. There were whispers in the saloons and the general store. Old-timers who had seen frontier justice in all its forms began to exchange glances that communicated what words could not. Young men who believed in right and wrong started to feel the ground shifting beneath them. Women who had lost husbands or sons or brothers to violence that went unpunished stopped attending Sunday services. The church pews grew emptier, even as the judge's donations grew larger. The third case involved a man named Coleman Reese. He was not from Ashford. He was not from Montana. He was a hired gun who had drifted up from Texas with a reputation that preceded him like the smell of sulfur. He had killed at least 7 men, possibly twice that number, always in circumstances that skirted the edges of legality. He was fast with a pistol and utterly without conscience, and he had been hired by a mining company to resolve a labor dispute in the camps 20 miles east of Ashford. The labor dispute was resolved when 2 union organizers were found dead in a ravine, each shot once through the head. Witnesses placed Coleman Reese at the scene. A miner named Joseph Keller had seen Reese talking with the 2 men hours before they died. Another miner had seen Reese riding away from the area around the time the bodies were discovered. The mining company claimed Reese was on their payroll, but insisted he was there only to provide security, not to commit murder. The trial drew attention from as far away as Butte and Missoula. Newspapermen came to observe. The courtroom was packed each day with miners, townspeople, company men, and curious onlookers. Joseph Keller testified clearly and without hesitation. He described seeing Reese, described the conversation, described the look in Reese's eyes that suggested a man preparing for violence. Other witnesses corroborated his account. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The prosecutor, a dedicated young attorney named Samuel Worth, built a case that seemed airtight. But the night before closing arguments, Judge Cobb received another visitor. This one represented the mining company. The conversation was brief. The amount was substantial, $500 in gold certificates, plus a promissory note for future considerations. Judge Cobb held the certificates in his hands and felt their weight. He thought about his wife. He thought about his position. He thought about the house he wanted to build on the hill overlooking town. He thought about how easy it had become. When Samuel Worth delivered his closing argument, Judge Cobb appeared to listen with his customary gravity. When the defense rested, Cobb addressed the jury with a voice that carried the weight of authority. He spoke about the high standard of proof required in capital cases. He spoke about the dangers of convicting a man on circumstantial evidence alone. He spoke about how the law protects even the most unsavory characters because it must protect everyone equally or it protects no one at all. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned with a verdict of not guilty. Joseph Keller, the miner who had testified against Reese, left the courtroom with his head bowed. He was found 3 weeks later in an abandoned mine shaft with his neck broken. The county sheriff ruled it an accident. Coleman Reese was seen in Ashford twice more before disappearing into the territories. He killed at least 2 more men in the following year, both times walking away without consequence. Samuel Worth, the prosecutor, resigned his position 4 months after the trial. He moved to Oregon and never practiced law again. Years later, in a letter to a friend, he would write that he had witnessed something in that courtroom that shattered his belief in the system he had devoted his life to upholding. He never specified what he had witnessed. He didn't need to. Judge Cobb continued his work. The cases accumulated. The bribes arrived with increasing frequency, delivered by intermediaries and fixers, hidden in books and false-bottomed trunks, buried in his garden at night by men whose faces he never saw clearly. He stopped keeping precise records. He stopped justifying his decisions to himself. The rationalizations that had once been necessary became irrelevant. He was a judge. He rendered judgments. The law was complex, and interpretation was subjective, and reasonable people could disagree about outcomes. These were the things he told himself when he thought about it at all. Mary Cobb grew distant. She had always been a quiet woman, but her silence took on a different quality. She stopped tending her garden. She stopped going to the mercantile. She spent long hours sitting by the window, staring out at nothing. When her husband spoke to her, she responded with single words or not at all. At night, she lay beside him in their bed like a stranger, her breathing shallow and careful, as if she were afraid to disturb something that slept in the darkness between them. The 4th case, the 5th, the 6th, they blurred together into a procession of faces and verdicts and envelopes passed in shadow. A rustler who had murdered a sheep herder went free. A gambler who had shot an unarmed man during a card game received a suspended sentence. A foreman who had beaten a worker to death was acquitted on grounds of self-defense despite evidence suggesting the worker had been tied to a post at the time. Each case added another layer to the sediment of corruption that was slowly burying the town's faith in justice. People stopped bringing certain kinds of cases to trial. If the accused had money or connections, victims knew there was little point in seeking legal remedy. Families began settling disputes through private means. Vendettas sprouted like weeds. A man whose brother had been murdered by a claim jumper who walked free from Cobb's courtroom took justice into his own hands and was subsequently hanged for murder. Judge Cobb presided over that trial too. The irony was noted, but never spoken aloud. The town began to hollow out. Young families left for places where the law still meant something. Businesses closed. The newspaper that had covered Coleman Reese's trial shut down when the editor moved to Billings, citing personal reasons that everyone understood were not personal at all. The Presbyterian Church lost its minister when Reverend Thomas resigned and accepted a position in a parish 300 miles away. In his final sermon, he spoke about the prophet Amos and the words that had echoed through centuries. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. He did not look at Judge Cobb when he spoke those words, but everyone knew where they were aimed. Cobb's wealth grew. He built the house on the hill, a 2-story structure with gabled windows and a wraparound porch that offered views of the entire valley. Mary refused to move into it. She stayed in a house on Elm Street, and Cobb found himself living alone in his monument to success, eating meals at a long table meant for dinner parties that never happened, sleeping in a bedroom decorated with furnishings meant to impress visitors who never came. He began drinking more, not enough to impair his function in court, but enough to dull the edges of thoughts that occasionally surfaced in the quiet hours before dawn. He would sit in his study with a glass of whiskey and the lamp turned low, looking at the law books that lined his shelves, volumes he had once studied with genuine devotion. Now they seemed like relics from someone else's life, artifacts from a version of Harlan Cobb, who had believed the words printed on those pages actually mattered. The 7th case was different. It involved a woman. Her name was Sarah Brennan. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a blacksmith who had worked in Ashford for 25 years. She had been walking home from the schoolhouse where she worked as an assistant teacher when she was attacked by 3 men. They dragged her into an alley behind the feed store. What they did to her there took 17 minutes, according to a shop owner who heard her screaming but was too frightened to intervene. When it was over, they left her bleeding in the dirt and went to the saloon to drink. She managed to walk to the doctor's office. The doctor treated her injuries and called the sheriff. The sheriff arrested the 3 men within 2 hours. They did not deny what they had done. They laughed about it. One of them, a ranch hand named Billy Cates, said she had been asking for it. Another, a drifter named Frank Loomis, said she should be grateful they hadn't killed her. The third man was the son of a territorial judge from Helena, a young man named Garrett Monroe who had come to Ashford to learn the cattle business and had instead learned that wealth and family connections could insulate a person from consequence. His father sent an attorney, a sharp-dressed man from the East who understood how things worked in frontier courts. The attorney met with Judge Cobb in chambers on a Thursday afternoon. The conversation was the most explicit one yet. No euphemisms, no careful language. The attorney laid out the situation plainly. Garrett Monroe could not be convicted. His father's position made it impossible. A conviction would create complications that extended beyond Montana territory. Acquittal was the only acceptable outcome. The price for ensuring that outcome was $1,000 in gold, to be paid immediately, with additional compensation available for future cooperation on other matters. Judge Cobb listened. He looked at the attorney's well-fed face, at the gold watch chain stretched across his vest, at the manicured fingernails and the smug certainty in his eyes. For a moment, something stirred in Cobb that might have been the ghost of the man he had once been or thought he had been. The moment passed. He accepted the money. The trial was a formality. Sarah Brennan testified with her father sitting beside her, holding her hand. She described what had happened in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. The courtroom sat in absolute silence. Women wept. Men stared at the floor or at the defendants with expressions that suggested they were calculating whether they could reach the men before the sheriff stopped them. Judge Cobb listened impassively. When Sarah finished, he asked if she was certain about the identification. She said she was. He asked if it had been dark. She said there had been enough light. He asked several more questions, each one seeming to cast a small shadow of doubt, each one suggesting that perhaps she was mistaken, perhaps she had been confused, perhaps her trauma had affected her memory. The defense attorney called witnesses who testified to the upstanding character of Garrett Monroe. He presented an alibi that was transparently false, but delivered with confidence. He argued that Sarah Brennan was a woman of questionable morals who had been seen speaking with men unchaperoned, who had encouraged the defendant's attention, who now regretted her choices and sought to destroy innocent men's reputations. Judge Cobb's instructions to the jury were a masterpiece of subtle manipulation. He emphasized the burden of proof. He highlighted inconsistencies in the testimony that existed only in his interpretation of it. He reminded them that a man's entire life could be destroyed by a false accusation. He spoke about mercy and caution and the terrible responsibility of judgment. The jury convicted Billy Cates and Frank Loomis. They acquitted Garrett Monroe. Sarah Brennan's father stood up when the verdict was read. He was a large man with blacksmith's arms and a face weathered by decades of honest work. He looked at Judge Cobb with an expression that contained no anger, only a kind of infinite sadness, as if he were witnessing the final corruption of something he had once believed sacred. He said nothing. He simply took his daughter's arm and led her from the courtroom. They left Ashford 3 days later. The blacksmith shop stood empty for a month before someone else took it over. No one spoke Sarah Brennan's name again, as if by collective agreement the town had decided to erase her from memory rather than confront what her suffering revealed about the rottenness at the heart of their community. Billy Cates and Frank Loomis were hanged on a Friday morning in October. A crowd gathered to watch. Judge Cobb did not attend. Garrett Monroe left town the same day, heading back to Helena and a life that would continue uninterrupted by consequence or remorse. Something broke in Ashford after that trial. The pretense of civility, already worn thin, tore completely. The saloons grew louder and more violent. Fights broke out over nothing. A gambler was stabbed to death over a disputed poker hand, and no one was arrested because no one wanted to bring the case before Judge Cobb's court. A woman disappeared and was found weeks later in the river, and the sheriff wrote it up as accidental drowning, though everyone knew her husband had likely killed her, and everyone knew there was no point in pursuing charges. Judge Cobb continued his work. He presided over trials and rendered judgments and collected his fees. The bribes grew larger and more frequent. Word had spread across the territories that Judge Harlan Cobb's court was a place where certain outcomes could be purchased. Criminals began making their way to Ashford specifically because they knew they could find sanctuary there. The town became a destination for men who existed outside the law or needed the law bent in their favor. They came and they paid and they walked away, leaving behind a trail of unpunished violence and unopened cases that piled up in the sheriff's office like monuments to futility. The sheriff himself, a decent man named Thomas Creek who had held the position for 12 years, resigned after the Sarah Brennan trial. He turned in his badge and left town without explanation. His replacement was a man named Silas Moon, who had previously worked as a guard in the territorial prison and who understood that in Ashford the position of sheriff was less about enforcing the law than about maintaining the appearance that law still existed. He did his job accordingly, arresting drunks and breaking up fights and making sure the streets stayed clear of bodies. But bringing serious criminals to justice was something he knew better than to attempt. Mary Cobb died in the winter of 1887. The doctor said it was pneumonia, but everyone knew she had been dying slowly for years, wasting away in that house on Elm Street like a plant deprived of light. Judge Cobb arranged for a funeral at the Presbyterian church. A handful of people attended, mostly out of obligation. The new minister, a young man fresh from seminary who didn't know Mary Cobb or the town's history, delivered a generic eulogy about faith and eternal rest. They buried her in the cemetery on the north edge of town, in a plot that would have a nice view if the dead could see. Cobb returned to his empty house on the hill. He sat in his study and drank whiskey and looked out the window at the lights of Ashford scattered below in the darkness. He thought about his wife, about the woman she had been when he married her, about the hope in her eyes that had died so slowly he hadn't noticed until it was completely gone. He thought about asking himself whether it had been worth it, but he already knew the answer, and the answer was unbearable. So he poured another drink instead. The 8th case, the 9th, the 10th. They continued. A man who had tortured a homesteader to learn where he had hidden his savings walked free. A gang of rustlers who had killed a rancher and his 2 sons received sentences so light they amounted to a paid vacation. A land speculator who had burned out 3 families and killed a man who refused to sell his property was acquitted on the grounds that the prosecution had failed to establish motive, as if motive were somehow obscure in a case involving money and greed and the taking of land by force. Each verdict drove another family from Ashford. Each acquittal sent ripples of despair through a community that had once believed in the possibility of justice. The town that had been thriving when Cobb arrived was now a husk, populated by those too poor to leave and those who profited from the corruption. The honest merchants closed their shops. The farmers sold their land for whatever they could get. The schoolhouse lost so many students that it operated only 3 days a week. The church held services for a congregation that rarely numbered more than a dozen. Cobb watched it all from his position behind the bench, a man who had become less a judge than a priest presiding over the death of his own parish, absolving sins he had enabled, pronouncing benedictions over a system he had hollowed out from within. He was 62 years old when John Brennan came to see him. It was a Thursday evening in late April. The snow had melted, and the first green shoots were beginning to appear on the hillsides. Cobb was in his study, working through paperwork for an upcoming case, when he heard the knock on the front door. He answered it himself. He had no servants. No one would work for him. John Brennan stood on the porch. He was older than Cobb remembered, grayer, more stooped. He held his hat in his hands, and his eyes were red-rimmed, as if he had been crying or had not slept in days. He said, "Judge Cobb, I need to talk to you." Cobb hesitated. Something in Brennan's face triggered an instinct that warned him to close the door, to call for help, to do anything except let this man inside. But he was the judge. He was Harlan Cobb. He had faced down outlaws and criminals and dangerous men. What was there to fear from a blacksmith whose spirit had been broken years ago? He stepped aside and let Brennan in. They sat in the study. Cobb offered whiskey. Brennan declined. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. Finally, Brennan said, "My daughter died last month." Cobb said nothing. "She was in San Francisco," Brennan continued. His voice was steady but hollow, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. "She worked in a laundry. She lived in a boarding house with 6 other women. She didn't talk much," they said. "Kept to herself. One night, she filled her pockets with rocks and walked into the bay. They found her 3 days later." Cobb's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "She left a letter," Brennan said, "addressed to me. It talked about what happened to her here, about the trial, about how she couldn't understand why the law didn't protect her, about how she couldn't live with what had been done to her and what was done to her after, when the man who hurt her walked free and she had to carry the weight of it alone." Tears were running down Brennan's face now, but his expression had not changed. He stared at Cobb with eyes that looked like they were seeing something beyond the physical world. "I came here to kill you," Brennan said. Cobb felt his heart seize. He started to stand. Brennan raised a hand. "Sit down, Judge. I'm not going to do it. I wanted to. God knows I wanted to. I bought a gun. I learned how to use it. I planned it out. I thought about it every day for a month. But then I realized something." He leaned forward. "Killing you would be mercy. It would be quick. You'd be gone, and you wouldn't have to live with what you've done. And that's not justice. Justice is you sitting here every night in this big, empty house, knowing what you are, knowing what you've destroyed, knowing that everyone in this town knows. You wanted money and position and comfort, and you got them, but look around, Judge. Look at what you have." Cobb could not speak. His mouth was dry. His chest felt tight. "My daughter is dead because of you," Brennan said softly. "My wife left me because I couldn't protect Sarah, because I brought her to this town and believed the law would keep her safe. I lost everything. But you, Judge Cobb, you lost more. You just don't know it yet. Or maybe you do. Maybe that's why you drink alone in the dark. Maybe that's why your wife died in a house you wouldn't visit. Maybe you know exactly what you are, and you have to live with it every moment of every day." He stood up. He put his hat on. He walked to the door and stopped. "I hope you live a long time, Judge. I hope you live to be 100. I hope every one of those years weighs on you like stone." He left. Cobb heard the door close. He sat in his chair, staring at the wall, unable to move. Outside, night fell completely. The lamp burned lower. The whiskey sat untouched. Time passed. Minutes or hours, he could not tell. Eventually, he stood. He walked upstairs to his bedroom. He lay down on the bed without undressing. He stared at the ceiling until dawn broke through the windows. John Brennan's words echoed in his head. They would echo there for the rest of his life. 3 months later, a circuit judge from Helena arrived in Ashford to investigate reports of judicial misconduct. The territorial governor had received complaints, letters from former residents, accounts of trials that seemed to suggest corruption. An official inquiry was warranted. The circuit judge met with witnesses. He reviewed case files. He examined verdicts and sentences and patterns that emerged when you looked at the record as a whole. What he found was damning, but difficult to prove. Corruption left fingerprints only if someone was careless enough to create a paper trail. Judge Cobb had been careful. The money had always come in cash. The conversations had always been private. The witnesses to his crimes were criminals themselves, and criminals made poor witnesses. The inquiry concluded with a report that noted irregularities and concerns, but stopped short of recommending removal from bench. The evidence was circumstantial. The burden of proof in such matters was high. Without cooperation from those who had paid the bribes, or without confession from the judge himself, there was little the territorial government could do. Judge Harlan Cobb retained his position. The circuit judge returned to Helena and filed his report and moved on to other matters. The territorial government had larger concerns. The railroad was coming. Statehood was being discussed. A corrupt judge in a dying town in the middle of nowhere was not worth the political capital required to remove him. Cobb continued his work, but something had changed. The bribes stopped coming. Word had spread about the investigation. Criminals who might have sought him out now avoided Ashford entirely. The cases that came before his court were minor disputes and small crimes, the routine business of a backwater jurisdiction. There was nothing left to corrupt because there was nothing left to save. The town continued its decline. By 1890, Ashford's population had dropped by more than half. The courthouse still stood, but court was held only once a month, sometimes less. The judge sat behind his bench in the empty courtroom, presiding over cases that didn't matter, rendering judgments that affected no one, a king in a ruined kingdom with no subjects left to rule. He was 67 years old when the telegram arrived from Helena. The territorial governor was appointing a new judge to the circuit. Judge Harlan Cobb's services were no longer required. He was being retired with a small pension, effective immediately. He read the telegram twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He sat in his study and poured a drink. He thought about the house on the hill that no one would buy, about the law books that no one would read, about the career that had promised so much and delivered only this. He thought about Mary, dead these 3 years, buried in a grave he had not visited since the funeral. He thought about Sarah Brennan, drowned in San Francisco Bay with rocks in her pockets. He thought about Thomas Riddle and Dutch Harmon and Joseph Keller and all the others whose names he had tried to forget, but that visited him in the hours before dawn when sleep would not come and the darkness pressed in from all sides. He thought about John Brennan's words, "I hope you live a long time." He did. He lived another 14 years. The pension was small, but sufficient for a man living alone with simple needs. He moved out of the house on the hill and took rooms above a dry goods store that was itself barely surviving. He spent his days walking the empty streets of Ashford, a ghost haunting the ruins of the town he had helped destroy. People who saw him looked away. No one spoke to him unless business required it. He ate his meals alone. He drank alone. He slept alone when sleep came. And when it did not come, he lay in the darkness and counted the cost of everything he had done. The years ground on. Ashford continued to shrink. The railroad finally came through, but the line was built 15 miles to the south, and that killed whatever hope remained that the town might revive. Buildings fell into disrepair. The courthouse was converted into a grain storage facility. The church closed. The school closed. By the turn of the century, fewer than 200 people remained, eking out existence in a place that had become synonymous with failure and forgotten dreams. Judge Harlan Cobb died on a cold morning in January 1904. He was 81 years old. A neighbor found him 3 days later, frozen in his bed, his face turned toward the window as if he had been looking at something in the distance when death finally claimed him. There was no funeral. No one came forward to make arrangements. The county buried him in the Ashford Cemetery in an unmarked grave far from the plot where Mary rested. No stone was erected. No name was recorded. Within a generation, even the location of the grave was forgotten. The house on the hill stood empty for another decade before it burned down in a fire of unknown origin. Some said it was lightning. Others said it was deliberately set by someone who wanted to erase the last physical evidence of Cobb's presence. No one investigated. No one cared. Ashford itself barely survived the Depression. By 1950, it was a near ghost town, home to fewer than 50 souls. The buildings collapsed. The streets grew over with weeds. The cemetery was swallowed by prairie grass and wild roses. The stones toppled and broken. The names weathered into illegibility. Today, if you know where to look, you can find the site where Ashford once stood. There is a historical marker on the highway, noting the town's founding date and its incorporation into the state. It mentions the silver boom that never quite materialized and the railroad that passed it by. It does not mention Judge Harlan Cobb. But if you walk the ruins on a quiet day, when the wind moves through the grass and the shadows grow long, you can almost hear the echoes. The voices of people who believed in justice and found only its absence. The footsteps of those who fled when hope died. The sound of a gavel falling in an empty courtroom, rendering verdicts that served no one but the corrupt and the cruel. Judge Harlan Cobb took his bribes from killers. He freed the guilty and enriched himself and destroyed the lives of the innocent. He lived a long life in a dying town, watching everything he had built crumble to dust. And in the end, he died alone, forgotten, unmourned, his name spoken only as a warning about what happens when the law becomes a weapon for sale to the highest bidder. The graves are all unmarked now. The stones have fallen. The names are gone. But the ground remembers. The land remembers. And somewhere in the ruins of Ashford, in the silence that settles when the wind dies down, you can still feel the weight of all that was lost, all that was betrayed, all that could never be made right. Justice did not come for Judge Harlan Cobb, not in the way that stories promise it will. He was never tried. He was never punished. He was never made to answer for his crimes. But he lived with them. Every day of his long and lonely life, he lived with them. And perhaps, in the end, that was the only justice possible. Not the justice of courts and verdicts and sentences served, but the justice of a man condemned to walk through the wasteland he created, to see the faces of the people he had failed, to count the cost of his choices in the currency of sleepless nights and empty rooms, and the knowledge that when he died, no one would remember his name except as a curse. The story of Judge Harlan Cobb is not a story of redemption. There is no moment of realization, no dramatic confession, no final act of atonement that might have salvaged something from the wreckage. He was a man who made a choice, and then another choice, and then 1,000 more, each one easier than the last, until he became something he might not have recognized in his younger days when he still believed the words in those law books meant something. He was a man who sold justice to killers and died alone in a frozen room in a forgotten town. And the dead he left behind, they outnumbered the living, and their silence was louder than any testimony that was never heard in any court. That silence echoes still.